Welcome to Adventures Gone Mad, your critical look at D&D books. I am Kyle W., and I am here with my favoritist host.
Hey, it's Kyle A. What's going on?
So today we are going over the Dungeon Module X1, the Isle of Dread. So Kyle, do you have any past experience with Isle of Dread? Let's start there.
Yes. So I'm also the one who chose this module. I played it up to getting on a ship and going to the Isle of Dread and going to the first village, and that's it. When I was probably 10 years old or 11 years old. So that's pretty much all I remember about it. We didn't play through the entire module. I don't even know if my friend that was running it even read the entire module. I think he was reading it while we were playing it. So, but yeah, that is my actual experience with it.
So, do you remember how many sessions that was? That sounds like it's like one session, maybe.
Like maybe one session, yeah. It was like one session, and we never did anything past that. So
okay, so you knew that there was an isle, and then there was dread on it, and then that's probably it.
Yeah, and I had not actually read this module before, but it I now have read it, so there you go. But I was really interested in it, because it's like one of those ones that's pretty formative for a lot of people.
Yeah, and why? And since this is so on this podcast, we kind of go back and forth selecting modules. Why did you pick this one?
It's a classic module that so many people have run in the past. They have fond memories of it, and it was in the expert set when the expert set came out in 1980, whatever, 2, I think. Or before that, 1979. And, it sort of has a lot of nostalgia for people. It also, has a lot of connections. So I thought it would be fun to sort of actually go through it and, see why people, I think it's actually a better module than Keep on the Borderlands. And I know that everyone had said that before, so.
Yeah, and it's definitely, and I will say this is a module that I hear about a lot. Or that I read about a lot. It's definitely the art is iconic. Before I started this podcast, I really started I should say before I started really looking at old D&D adventurers, I think this cover and the Keep on the Borderlands were the two that I knew.
Yeah, Jeff D did the cover for this, and Jeff D is my hero. I fell in love with his art. I tried to copy it when I was a kid so many times. His art is literally that is my go-to when I think of classic D&D stuff. That's the art style I always wanted to mimic. So Kyle, what do you have as experience when it comes to Isle of Dread? What do you know about it?
So before I read it, I was able to recognize the art. I've heard about it. I did know that it's a really beloved adventure. And if you were to make an adventure list of the top 20 adventures of all time, I know that this would make it on there, and maybe on the top 10 of all time for a lot of people. People really, really love this adventure. So I didn't really know much about it. I knew the cover art. I knew that it took place on an island. And that's pretty much all that I knew about it. So this was a pretty fresh take for me because I had never read this, and I didn't really know much about it other than it's kind of famous for a lot of reasons. It being in the expert box, this and Keeping the Borderlands are probably the two most played modules for people of this era, I would say.
Yeah, because Keeping the Borderlands is probably going to get you level 3, and then you could go right into playing this.
Right, and so kind of starting off with the Isle of Dread, which printing were you reading?
I'm reading the one that comes in Godwin Games, or Goodman Games, rather. I'm not sure. It was the one from 1980. It was published in 1981. So yeah, it's, they talk about in, all the different editions of the Isle of Dread. But, this one is the one that came in the expert set.
Yes. And I got a copy of the one that came in the expert set, the 1980s printing. There's a few printings of the Isle of Dread. One, famously, that is not as easy to get is the red cover with different art.
Yep.
And that is referenced, I think, buy the Goodwin Games hardcover because the back is red and the front is blue.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And that has caused me some trouble finding that on my shelf because I keep looking for it and being like, I know it's blue, but the spine is red. So
yeah.
I keep overlooking it, not finding it.
That's funny.
So there's been a few reprintings of this. And so it was the original printing was 1980. It was included in the expert set of D&D. So the expert set was the higher level rules starting at level 3. And it was called expert, I guess, because it included some more rules. And to this day, I still think a lot of people play expert D&D. Like, it's very popular.
Yeah, I guess if you just want something that's pretty... I mean, it's very board game-esque in a lot of ways when you start playing D&D with just that rule set. You're not getting into too much crazy like rolls and things and have to figure out stuff. You're just sort of like, okay, I roll, you die, cool.
You're not spending an hour and a half figuring out how to dual wield.
Yeah, and you're not going through and like, well, I have the choice of these 17 spells at first level. Which one should I pick? There's like, well, you have your choice of like 6, you know.
So this was printed in the 1980s, the original printing. At that time, the most popular movie is a movie you might have heard of called The Empire Strikes Back. And the most popular album, according to Billboard charts, was The Wall by Pink Floyd.
I remember I lived in Eureka, a small town, and we went to go see The Empire Strikes Back with all of our friends, a bunch of our friends. Oh, no, we were going to go see it. But my mom said, let's go early. So me and my mom, and I think my brother, went and stood in line either opening night or the day after for Empire Strikes Back, waiting in this line. The theater was completely full, and we watched Empire Strikes Back in the corner of the movie theater because we didn't get great seats. And it was fantastic.
You're like, I don't care. Like,
yeah, it was like literally jaw-dropping, so much going on in there, and lightsabers and Luke and hands, and yeah, it's great.
It's my favorite Star Wars movie. I think like most people, it's probably their favorite Star Wars movie. I can't imagine seeing that. Like, as someone who, was born after that era, I cannot imagine seeing The Empire Strikes Back in theaters.
I will controversially say it is not my favorite Star Wars film. The first one, or A New Hope, is my favorite. Only because I have such nostalgia for that film and it being the first thing and having such a having a completely different experience and just thinking I didn't even think stories could be like this, and still loving The Empire Strikes Back, don't get me wrong. And now as an adult, when I look at The Empire Strikes Back, I go, yeah, it's kind of a better movie, but I still love the original Star Wars more than anything else.
So you could have conceivably gone to the music store, bought Pink Floyd's The Wall on vinyl, and then went and watched The Empire Strikes Back in the movie theater, and then went to the game store and bought the D&D expert box set, and this is what would have been in it.
Most people were buying tapes, Kyle. We weren't buying vinyl. We were buying tapes.
Oh, was it? I'm probably getting the tape. I mean, I grew up with tapes too, so I don't know.
Yeah, we grew up with tapes. Like we would get the tape of Pink Floyd.
All right. And then as far as that goes, some notes on the authors. So there's 2 authors that are credited for this. It is David Cook, who also goes by Zeb Cook. You will see him credited as Zeb Cook in many other things. Zeb Cook has done multiple adventures. He's worked on multiple settings, like he did Oriental Adventures. He's worked on Top Secret. And he was the lead designer for 2nd edition. And he's also worked on Planescape, the setting Planescape. And the other author is Tom Moldvay, which we have talked about in this podcast as far as the D&D basic set. There's another strange link between this podcast and Isle of Dread that I do want to bring up, that I was noticing when I read the forwards in the Goodman Games Adventures Reincarnated. There's a forward in there by a Dungeon Crawl Classics module writer. His name is Harley Stroh. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I've never actually said this person's name out loud now that I think about it. It's only been in my head. But the first adventure that he worked on for Dungeon Crawl Classics was Dungeon Crawl Classics 17. It was called Legacy of the Savage Kings. And that adventure I have played with you.
Oh, really?
Yes. So I was reading through and I was like, wait a second, that sounds familiar. And I looked it up. So that adventure was the adventure that I bought that made me like. So I went into the game store and there was Dungeon Crawl Classics at the time. There was it was kind of like a magazine rack that had these small Dungeon Crawl Classics books. And I was like, well, this is like a much cheaper than like getting a normal the adventures that I was used to at the time. Because at that time, most of them were hardcover. And it was like a much smaller, quicker read. It was like a magazine. So I ended up picking it up. And it was Dungeon Crawl Classics. So it was structured as an old D&D, like the D&D adventures we've been reading.
Right.
And it's the thing that made me interested in even going back and looking at these old adventures, was reading through that adventure.
Oh, okay.
And we played a few sessions of Legacy of the Savage Kings back in, I want to say it's probably 2005 or 6 at this point.
Yeah, in Tucson, was that 4th edition?
It was 3rd edition. And the only thing I remember about that game is that you played a Warforged Paladin. And in that adventure, there's like a disease or something that is like spreading. And I remember that you guys went to a town and all these people were suffering from this disease. And as the DM, I had the like person that runs the town ask you as a paladin to mercy kill everyone because you were immune to the disease.
Nice.
And I remember you being like, oh, wait, let me talk to my church before I start mercy killing people. I don't know about this.
Yeah, I'm going to have to pray to some gods and stuff. I'm not sure about this one.
I don't know if you remember that, but that is a weird link that we have with not only through this podcast, but...
Do not remember any of that. I remember 0% of that.
Okay, that's funny.
But it sounds like something you would do to me and say like, okay, yeah, you got to mercy kill all these people. Like, what? Kyle the player's like, yeah, no, we'll just kill them all. It's cool.
And some additional notes about Zeb Cook. I'm just going to call him Zeb Cook. I see him called that in interviews all the time. I think that's the name he actually goes by. But Zeb Cook, he's also been credited as a designer on Fallout 2. And is currently designing for, as far as I can tell, is currently designing for ESO, which is Elder Scrolls Online.
Interesting.
So Zeb Cook went on to make a lot of editions of the game, worked on multiple editions of the game, and worked on a lot of settings. I do want to also mention that the Isle of Dread is mentioned in the Dungeon Master Guide for 5th edition 2014. In that, it says that the Isle of Dread is located in the elemental plane of water, and that's all it says about it. Doesn't give you any other info, and I'm not even sure if it's referring to the same Isle of Dread that's in this module, or if it's an Easter egg just referencing the name. I can't tell.
Yeah, I have no idea. That's really interesting.
So it technically exists in 5th edition, I guess, but it might be an Easter egg. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe just sort of saying, hey, you could make the Isle of Dread in the elemental plane of water. Okay.
Right. Or there are some people that they're like, hey, when people read this, they're going to know I'm referencing this one. They're going to see the Isle of Dread, and good brain chemicals are going to come out of their brains.
Yeah, I mean, I know I do. That happens a lot with me. You're talking about the thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Unix, I know this. Not Unix.
I love Pokemon. So, the Goodman Games, this is another adventure that has a Goodman Games Adventures Reincarnated, which is, a series we're going to keep coming back to. It's probably like the biggest inspiration for this podcast.
Right.
So unfortunately, Tom Moldvay has passed away prior to this book coming out. There is a foreword by one of his contemporaries, Lawrence Schick, which in the foreword, Lawrence talks about creating the known world with Tom Moldvay, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but that is going to be important for this setting.
Yeah, that's the first thing. That's the first thing in the module that you read about, because they talk about the map first. And
there in Zeb Cook's foreword, there is something I did want to bring up. He mentions that there's two things he mentions that are kind of important to keep in mind as we're reading this module. One, Zeb Cook worked on the plateau in the center of the island, and Tom Moldvay worked on everything else.
Really?
Yes, so they split up their work between, as they planned this out, they said, okay, we're going to make it so it fits together. and Zeb Cook's going to work on the center, and then Tom Moldvay did the outside and all the Wandering Monsters.
Okay.
But the other thing he mentions is very important as we're reading this is he claims that they hammered this out in a few months with minimal playtesting. They did not have a lot of time to make this module.
Yeah, that seems to be kind of the impetus in most of these modules. Like, that's why you get some good ones and some bad ones, is they just don't have the time to like do anything. It's all sort of slapdash together in a lot of ways. It's like they want to get product out the door.
Yeah, and Mark Rosewater, who is a designer for Magic the Gathering, one of the things he always says is like restriction breeds creativity. So there is like, I guess, some creative magic that can happen from like trying to meet a deadline, but still it would probably, it makes me think of like what adventure would we have got had they had 6 months to work on this instead of 1 or 2.
It might not even have been that good.
Yeah, like maybe the adventure...
It might have been worse.
Yeah, exactly. Just because it would have been different doesn't mean it would have been better. So this is going to be known... This adventure is known as the origin of the known world. As we are opening up into the adventure, one of the first things that we talk about is the known world, which is on page 3. And it shows you... It gives you... First of all, there's a map for... It's not just the setting for the Isle of Dread, but it's everything around it. And it's all these different nations. And on page 3, we get a description of all of them.
Yeah, I also want to... The map itself is literally like when you talk about they didn't have enough time to do anything. Yeah, that map sort of shows it. It is a very crude looking map. I remember as a kid looking at it and going like, I think I could do better than this.
Yeah, it is. It's about half a page. Well, actually, it's a full page spread, which, interestingly enough, half of it is water. Yeah,
because they want to show where the Isle of Dread is, and it's obviously off away from all of the known world, so to speak. And yeah, it's just, yeah, it's put together. I mean, it's good enough.
In the intro to the foreword of the Goodman Games version, the foreword by Lawrence Schick talks about creating the known world with Tom Moldvay, which they did prior to this module. And it sounds like because of how much time that they didn't have time on this, basically Tom Moldvay was like, hey, I have this setting, we should use it. And it was kind of okayed. And basically the known world is a setting that they made where they made a list of historical cultures and societies, I guess, and peoples that they thought were interesting, because most people that worked on this were nerds. Okay, everyone that worked on this were nerds, and they were all interested in history.
Yeah.
And they essentially were like, hey, let's take these real world people and their history and map them to something in this world.
Yeah, you could tell that a bunch of history nerds looked at this and then they came together with something that was the known world.
Yeah, so the known world on page 3. So just in one page, we get 16 different nations and a brief explanation of what it is like in their region.
Yeah, in each one.
And there's some interesting things in here that I did kind of want to pull up. So the principalities of... as a warning, I'm probably going to say these names wrong. There is actually a pronunciation table in here, but I have no idea how to read it. So the principalities of Glantry is referenced as a mageocracy, which is a word that D&D still uses.
Yeah, it's really interesting looking at all of these. And so you remember I was 10 years old when I was looking at this, and like there's some big words. You have, and made up words, obviously, like a mageocracy. But I don't, like, an ocracy in and of itself is something that 10-year-old Kyle is going like, what?
Did 10-year-old Kyle go up to your mom and say, what is a mageocracy?
No, but, I think part of it was just reading this and just sort of glancing over it, which happened a lot when I was a little kid. You just sort of, like, read over it, and you're like, I don't know what that means, but I'm just going to keep reading.
So they didn't teach you about the emirate of Yalarum?
No, like what an autocracy is, or some of the other ones that are really funny, like the 5 shires where it's like, oh yes, we have a council. They meet every, quarter. They get drunk, and then they decide on things by voting. Like, what?
One of the things I notice when I read this is D&D still does this. Like, this is still a way that we talk about places in a setting.
Yeah.
There will often be, hey, this is where everything is in this nation. Here's a paragraph about what it's like. And we're doing it for the first time here in 1980.
Yeah, as far as I know, like, this is the first time you published a module or published an event where we're sort of talking about each nation individually and in a fantasy world. And it has a little, I don't know, 3 or 4 sentences to a small paragraph of what it is.
Yeah, and it feels like there's not that much detail on a lot of these, but they do want you to I think they want you to fill in information, and they don't have enough time to expand as well.
I mean, there's a lot of densely packed information in that one page, and then it goes on to the next page where it just talks about the pronunciations, and then the climate. Like, what is the climate like? Oh, okay.
And the known world would eventually become known as a Mystara, would be the setting that this is referred to as later.
Oh, okay.
So the known world is in Mystara, which, was later made famous by the famous Capcom game Shadows over Mystara, which I will reference in this podcast all the time because it's amazing.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, every single nation that is mentioned on page 3, there in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a series published by TSR called the Gazetteer series, where they gave each one of these nations their own book.
Really?
Yeah, so there's a 5 Shires book. There is a book for each one of these. You can get them right now on DM's Guild.
Nice. Well, that's cool.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't read through any of them. I can't tell you how great they are. Maybe one day we'll read through them. But yeah, every single one of the nations on this book in the known world eventually got its own, like, fully expanded book.
That's awesome. So that's how popular this module is.
Right. As far as popularity goes, it is interesting to think about that because in Ben Riggs, he hosts Reading D&D Out Loud, but he also wrote the book Slaying the Dragon. And in that book, there's a lot of talk about financials. And one of the things he repeatedly says is that settings sold horribly for D&D. So I don't know how well those Gadgeteer series actually sold.
Yeah, I think they probably didn't sell well at all. I mean, I never even heard of them. I do remember, like, there was a Greyhawk Gazetteer that was pretty popular. A lot of my friends had that. So it had, like, the Greyhawk stuff in it. It had all the deities and heroes and stuff in it. And it also had those maps, like the Greyhawk maps that everyone used to have, that were big fold-out maps of Greyhawk that people use. Like, we were using them for other, just because the map was so great and nice to have. Half the time my friends would be using that even though it wasn't Greyhawk.
Right, and this was back when you couldn't just you probably just couldn't go to Kinko's and print out a PDF of a map.
Right, exactly.
So the known world eventually became the Mystara setting. D&D eventually did something similar in 4th edition they used to call it the Points of Light setting, which was like the default 4th edition setting, and then it eventually became its own setting called Nintir Vale. So these people just can't stop making settings once they start. Once they start, they just can't stop.
Well, if you think about it, like, it's important to have the setting, and from a sort of a writer builder's point of view, it's super fun to, like, create your own setting. But really, like, it's more fun to actually play the modules of the game than it is to run around on your setting. It's nice to have all that information and have it all running around and being able to change it and add it. And that gives depth to your storytelling. But, it really just starts with the story of the players and what they're doing.
And I feel like once you start creating a setting like this, it eventually just creates itself. So I should just say Mystara created itself.
Yeah.
All right. So we skip to we go to the background of this adventure, which starts on page 4. And this is the way this adventure starts, the background that it gives you is that it says that the players find a scroll paper, and it goes into detail about how when you take this paper and you light it on fire or put it next to fire, it eventually gives you a player handout that is made by a pirate named Rory Barbarosa.
Good old Rory.
Which famously has like a cursive signature in the handout at the bottom.
I remember that handout. Everyone had pulled that handout out of their Isle of Dread. And, they would, it was in various states of repair, I will just say. I had this module. I have it downstairs somewhere, but I don't think I still have that handout anymore because it was a pullout. It was like a little like perforated pullout that you took out and handed to the player.
And so this background is funny to me for like a few reasons. First of all, it's like it's cool to get a pirate map from someone named Rory Barbarosa that basically is a treasure map that says like this is the Isle of Dread and there's a bunch of stuff here.
I think it's great because it sort of sets your mind in the realm of pirates and islands and buried treasure, like all of those elements. Just from a slip of paper, you're getting this wonderful sort of like idea in your head of what this adventure is going to be. It's going to be pirates and island and treasure and all that stuff.
I would like to read the beginning of this background, just like the first paragraph, because I just find this really interesting and funny to me. So, several weeks ago, the party of adventurers was returning from a previous adventure when they discovered a cache of scroll paper. The scroll paper was made of an excellent vellum parchment. On the journey home, the characters were caught in a sudden rainstorm and the entire cache was drenched. Upon the party's return to Specularum, it was found that none of them were magical. Still, magic users can always use good paper for spell research and writing their spellbooks, so the characters carefully spread the paper out in front of a fire to dry out. Much to their surprise, as the paper dried out, writing appeared on several of the pages. The heat had brought out secret writing on the parchment. The pages were part of a ship's log and read as follows. And then that is the handout from Rory Barbarosa that tells you about the island and how to get there.
Yeah, and what they found and all that.
A couple things about this intro. One, it just says a cache of spell papers and you return to Specularum. And when I read this, I was like, what the hell is Specularum? And I had to rifle through the book to find this. And it is actually a city that is referenced on the map and is not anywhere else in the book.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah. Like, because I was like, what is Specularum? Is this like a Greyhawk? Like, it sounds like a Greyhawk wizard or something to me.
Right.
But I just find it's funny to me how involved this intro is, where it's like, you got scrolls and then they got drenched. And then, of course, you want to sell them because they're worth money. So you sat them out to dry them off in fire. And then you saw this. It could have just been like you found a pirate letter.
Right. No, I think it's, one of the things that struck me is this is a campaign that's, you've had a group of characters you're already playing with, or in theory you would have already been playing with. So the idea is that like, oh, okay, well, maybe on that last adventure you found these parchments and now you're going to do something with them. So there's like a nice tie-in that you don't always get with modules. You don't always get with something like, oh, you got to figure that out. And here, like, this sort of, well, here's a nice way to stitch this stuff together. So I really like that, actually.
And when I read this, I just think of a video game cutscene, because it just talks about all this stuff that your characters do that you have no like say on. It's just like, this is the background. This is what happened between your adventures.
Yeah.
Which is like, it's fine. It's not, it's not a bad thing or anything. It's very different. I feel like now it would just be like, here, you find a pirate map. Go to this island.
Figure it out. Yeah. How does it tie in? I don't know. You figure it out. Or does it even matter that it ties in? But I like that they put that touch on there. It's also sort of like to, show, okay, this is this, the secret pirate map, I kind of love that about the start of this.
Now, Rory Barbarosa's letter does mention that there is a treasure on the Isle of Dread called the Black Pearl of the Gods. And as I read this, the more I read these old adventures and old modules, I think the assumption is always that like treasure is just enough to motivate any adventurer. That's the hook, is you get treasure.
Yeah, I mean, we tie experience to money, so it's all about accumulation of wealth And I remember, when I was younger, like that was the deal. It wasn't the story that mattered. It was because remember, you don't have that whole video game piece of like, I'm leveling up my character, so you wanted that. You wanted like, okay, I want to level up my character and I want to get more powerful. How do I do that? Well, if I get money, and I get money through experience, then, I will level my character and the character will become more powerful. There's less of like, I want to create a story and more of like, I want to make my character powerful.
Right. Like, of course, I'm playing an adventurer. Of course, I want to go to the Isle of Dread and get the Black Pearl of the Gods.
Right.
So there is some, and this is, we could probably talk about this now, but this comes up multiple times in the adventure. And it's talked about in Rory Barbarosa's letter. But there is a pretty, Wizards of the Coast doesn't do this anymore. But there is a fairly dated trope of island cannibals.
Yeah, there's a lot of tropey things in here that is a sign of the time. So it's one of the things that like we are definitely going to have to talk about a lot.
Yeah, this is going to come up multiple times in this podcast, but we are, we're kind of like, we're aware that this is, we're reading this as a historical document basically. But yeah, the first thing as I was reading this, like, wow, this would not be, they would not handle this type of thing like this now.
Yeah, I mean, we like to term that as like PC, PC, it's not, it's pretty insulting to a lot of people. But it is a fact of how this, the world was at the time.
Right. And this isn't the only media that has this trope. Like it's not only D&D. And we'll talk about this. I think we'll bring this up a little bit more later, but there was like a pop culture obsession with certain things like the cannibal, but there's also a pop culture obsession with things like shrunken heads. Like
right.
Around this time in the WWF, there's a group of wrestlers called the Head Shrinkers. Like we were as a culture just obsessed with that. It was everywhere.
There's a documentary about Vince McMahon and about the WWE and the rise of all of that, and it was just, there's so much cringe stuff like the evil, the Iron Sheik and all of those things that, there's no way any of that passes muster now. Like no one believes it and no one's into it. But at the time it seemed fine. And that's where the vein of this adventure is that, we're going to go find the cannibals or we're going to go find the pirates and, pirates are like this and they're going to wear a hat, speak like pirates.
So related to that, any of the gazetteer books that I just talked about, if you go look on DM's Guild or the online store for that they still sell that at, there is a huge disclaimer from Wizards of the Coast at the bottom that essentially says like, we understand that the things that are in this book were commonplace in American society at this time, but that does not mean we condone them.
Yeah, wise, right?
And yeah, they definitely, as far as they've definitely stepped on a few rakes here and there, but they watch for this type of thing. In Rory Barbarosa's letter, there is mention of cannibals on the island, and that it is dangerous and filled with things like dinosaurs.
Right, but that makes it exciting.
Yeah, exactly. So, getting into the adventure, one thing that I have noticed is that this is a much different adventure. So the expert rules have nature exploration rules in it for how to explore and do a hex crawl. And this book was made to use those rules. So they put it on an island so it would be enclosed. But because of that, there is no actual like starting area in this adventure. You basically go to the island and it is expected that the players land where they want to land. Yeah,
I mean, your job on part of this DM piece that isn't really explained to you is that you really want them to start in the village, like that you're supposed to sort of befriend them, and that's where you're going to start your base of operations. But it's pretty easy to see some knuckleheads just going like, we land here and start doing stuff.
We land here. Oh no, I am being eaten by pterodactyls and there's a T-Rex.
Which I think is kind of what happened when I played. I don't. It's hard. It was a long time ago. It was 40 years ago, so I don't remember exactly what happened. But it was something very similar. Of like you would roll on a wandering monster table. Okay, well, some things are attacking you, and there's only 2 of you, so you kind of die.
And I also wonder reading this, it's like, well, these are the expert rules. Everyone's an expert player now. They can figure out where to go on the island. So the Wandering Monster table on page 5, there's a mention here in the Wandering Monster table that I didn't really see in the older adventures that we read. And it says, if a monster is either much too strong or much too weak for the party, the DM may change the number appearing on the monster or the monster's hit points to provide a suitable challenge for the party. No like direction on how to do that. It's just like I kind of feel it out.
Yeah, figure it out. Don't let your players know how much hit points any of these things have, and then like, oh, it's dead. Oh, that's weird. You hit it? Okay, it's dead.
A lot of this adventure is wandering around the island and exploring it and running into these wandering monsters. So there's 3 tables of wandering monsters.
Yeah, there's a lot of wandering monsters.
And I still see, I just recently ran Tomb of Annihilation for 5th edition, and I see like some of that designed from this in that. Like looking through the Wandering Monsters table and the way that they handle the hex crawl. Very similar. It's an island that you wander around. And so speaking of the village, this is probably where you want to land. If you are a DM, you should probably steer your players towards here. And honestly, I feel like the book might have just said like, hey, you should start here.
Yeah. I mean, it seems pretty obvious that however you're going to structure this, you need to structure it in the village.
So the village, let me find this. So we run into the village of Tanaroa, which is number 1 on the encounter map. So that's how you know you're supposed to go there first.
Yep.
So this is, so it does talk about how the natives here are actually pretty friendly. Like they might shoot some arrows at you as you're approaching, but as soon as you prove to not be a threat, they will talk to you and are friendly. Each of this is a village of multiple clans, and each of them have a hut. So there's the Elk Clan, the Hawk Clan, the Tiger Clan, and the Sea Turtle Clan. And
they're matriarchies.
It is a matriarchy. The other thing that really sticks out to me about this village is this quote. The last important village official and advisor is the village zombie master.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a whole like headhunting villager jungle villages summoning zombie thing going on here as well, as a trope.
It's definitely like the witch doctor trope, essentially.
Yeah, for sure.
So the advisor, it's always going to be a 5th level cleric or magic user. This adventure is for levels 3 through 7. So 5th is like pretty high, but your players might eventually be higher than that through this adventure.
Yeah, and they're, it's not just a couple players. You're supposed to have, again, 6 to 10 or something like that.
Right. So it does say you should have, where is it?
Yeah, it's the same one we saw before of, you need at least 1 magic user, 1 cleric, or an elf. So you need somebody who can cast spells and somebody who can cast healing spells.
Yeah, I do thought it does say something about combined levels, but...
Oh, yeah.
What else was it? Oh, yeah. So the other thing that's weird about this zombie master that made me kind of stop and like reread this sentence, because it was, it's describing this village, and then it's like, by the way, each advisor is a zombie master.
Oh, by the way.
The cult, the advisor will be a cleric or magic user of at least 5th level who heads the cult of the Walking Dead in the village. The cult is a secret society whose members, except for the zombie master, wear hooded masks during cult ceremonies. At these ceremonies, the walking ancestors are created. While these zombies are sometimes used as laborers or spare warriors, the villagers shun and fear them. So there's a secret cult in the village of the nice natives.
Yep, and they use the zombies for laborers. I mean, why not?
So I mean that's like the detail that jumps out when you read this of like, whoa. So hopefully, I mean, that is a pretty interesting detail that there's some weird cult activity happening. It's obviously for them to be making more zombies, but it sounds like relatively harmless, even though zombies are evil, I guess.
Yeah. It's an interesting little piece. The other piece that kind of strikes me is, like, don't get on the bad side of this village because there's like 200 villagers and they're all going to fight you. So there's a pretty good chance, given the makeup of this village, that they could pretty much like kill you if they needed to.
There's 200 villagers. They're all going to fight you, and you're constantly running into these people throughout the adventures. They're all over the Wandering Monster tables.
Yep.
And it's funny, too, to think about. This was back when people might not have had the grasp on that sort of thing that we do now. So, some adventurers probably land on this island and were like, well, these people are worth experience. And then quickly they were all killed.
Get overwhelmed. And the nice DM's like, maybe you should friend them. And then evil DM's like, okay, yeah, they kill you. End of game. We're playing Keep on the Borderlands again.
Yeah. And this adventure is not... We're going through it like as we see stuff in the book we want to talk about, but this adventure is very, very non-linear. Like, there is kind of an end game and a last boss and like a harder area, but you can start anywhere and go anywhere and do this in any order, and it is written that way.
Yeah, it's specifically like, you don't have to start at the village. You could start anywhere. You could go anywhere in here. The idea is that, like, you go around this village, this island, and you sort of decide where you want to start. You want to start in the village, but if you don't have to.
Moving on page 9, we have the Rakasta camp. The Rakasta are a tribe of nomadic cat-like cat people, essentially. Now, when I first read this, I was like, oh, this is a typo of the Rakshasa.
Right.
And like they changed the name later. And so I looked it up, and that is not the case.
Nope.
So there's the cat people, the Rakasta, and the cat demons, the Rakshasa. It's not confusing at all.
No, like, why would we make those almost exactly the same, other than just to confuse you?
Granted, as I was reading this, as people were reading this in 1980, the Rakshasa were not in D&D yet. They were in they were in other religions, but they were not pulled into D&D yet.
And I do want to point out on page 8 that there is a whole pirates camp, because it is an island adventure, and you need a bunch of pirates that you need to fight too. But yeah, that they're not that important, but there are definitely pirates that you also encounter.
Yeah, so there is a camp of pirates that's on like a separate island, and that can be like an entire adventure. It could be like a dungeon of just killing all these pirates or dealing with all these pirates.
Yeah. So you're probably going to meet these pirates. You're probably going to meet them at some point. Maybe.
And this is also, from this edition of the game, one thing that I can tell is that it's never like, oh, there's 10 pirates in that building. It's like, yeah, this is the pirate's base, and there's 100 of them.
Yeah. It's pretty funny. It's like, there's 50, there's 50 pirates, not just one pirate. Or 10 pirates. There's 50.
There's also another place that you can take your ship to called the Lair of the Sea Snakes, which you can dive each day. The party dives for pearls. They find 1d4 pearls worth 100 gold each. However, they will be attacked by 1 to 4 sea snakes. Although the number of sea snakes is unlimited, the pearls will run out of 14 days. So there is infinite sea snakes.
Yeah, infinite sea snakes. What's the problem?
Just the concept of like infinite snakes, unlimited snakes, is very funny to me.
It's a video game. They just keep respawning.
Yeah, so moving back to the Rakasta camp, there's not like you could talk to them, but there's not really like too much going on. It tells you what all their treasures are in case you decide to murder them all.
Which is a recurring theme in all of these modules, that like there's a piece where, well, maybe you'll just murder everybody. And I think when I was 10, that's kind of what we did. We really didn't talk to anybody. We just kind of murdered everybody. Or they just were hostile from the beginning, and it was like, oh, well, this is just another board game fight.
Yeah, I mean, as a DM, it is much easier to run a hostile enemy than someone that talks to you, right?
Right.
And also, it also makes me wonder, like, if when they play tested this, did people often kill the friendly NPCs? But then, I read of like there wasn't much playtesting, and
Right.
I don't know if the concept of playtesting your game with people that don't know how to play the game was around, and if they just playtested with people who already knew how to play D&D and were good at
Right. Are we going to talk about the Phanatons?
Yeah. Do you want to bring up the Phanatons?
I love the Phanatons. So the next thing on here on this list, and you may not, whether you encounter them first or not, who knows, but there's a Phanaton kit, which is a new monster, and they're basically like raccoon flying squirrels, which is brilliant.
They are very cute.
Of course, they're adorable, but they also may, eat you. So, they're sort of a cross between a monkey and a raccoon, and they also are a flying squirrel.
Yeah, and they are intelligent.
Yeah, and they're smart. They cast spells, if I remember right, or can. Those are the spiders.
Those are their mortal enemies. They do that.
The mortal enemies, which are a bunch of spiders.
Yeah,
just amazing. No, they don't cast spells, but they're smart and they can use weapons and stuff like that. And there's 100 of them. Mm-hmm. So okay, baby, don't fight those either.
And their settlement is not a thing that you like walk around and see like, oh, there's a village. Their settlement is like way up in the trees, and you have to climb into the upper canopy to get to it. It's essentially a platform that they have made in the upper canopy where they fly from tree branch to tree branch like flying squirrels.
And on the first page of the module, they have a really great illustration by, I think it's Bill Willingham, who basically one guy is fighting, barbarian sort of character, is fighting a bunch of Phanatons. And, they all have knives in their tail. They're using their tails with, they have knives on them. And I think that's it's just great. Like, you're super cute, but they have fangs, and they kind of aren't happy. And the barbarian is punching one in the face, which is great.
Yeah, and there's 5 of them, and it's like a little silly. Like, he's kind of sitting on one, and it's making a like Looney Tunes eyes bugging out of its head face.
So good.
That is great art. I do love that. And it kind of looks like the Phanatons are winning in that.
Yeah, I think the Phanatons are going to kind of get to him.
So I have a memory of the So I looked up, like, I wanted to see, sometimes when I see these new monsters, my first question is like, do these still exist? Did they evolve into something else, or are they in a current D&D thing? And I looked up some of the art for the Phanaton, and they were included in the 2nd edition monster manual, and that's how I know them.
Ah, okay.
I recognize the art, but I do remember reading it when I was younger, and the 2nd edition monster manual had like a few paragraphs about like what the monster was like, and it talks about how the Phanatons hate the Aranea.
Okay.
And they will just kill them if they see them. And I just remember that being like, that's such a random thing. Did they pick that at random? Like,
yeah, when did that happen? No, it's I guess it's Tom Mulvey who chose that and said, yeah, they've got a mortal enemy who are the spider people.
Yeah, so I don't have direct confirmation of this, but Tom Mulvey did come up with the outside area, so I can only assume this, and the Wandering Monsters, so I can only assume this is his creation. His other claim to fame in this book is inserting dinosaurs everywhere.
Yeah, there are a lot of dinosaurs.
Wandering Monster Table is just filled with dinosaurs, and I'm assuming there are a lot of dinosaurs that, like, yes, there's like a T-Rex and a Brontosaurus, which is like the ones everyone knows about, but there are some that are like pretty obscure, and I don't think most people knew, what a plesiosaur was at that time, or a Dimetrodon.
Well, I remember when I was a little kid, I had a bunch of books on dinosaurs, and so I remember seeing these and going, oh yeah, no, I remember that dinosaur. And all the different names of them. It wasn't as in depth. I wasn't as into it as some kids were, but I remember having that dinosaur book and looking at all the dinosaurs and being like, oh, wow.
See, that's funny you say that, because I have that too, but I assumed that dinosaur phase was Jurassic Park was responsible for that dinosaur phase that every kid goes through. So it's interesting that happens pre-Jurassic Park. And
it's pre-Jurassic Park. Like, there's a reason why Spielberg was interested in dinosaurs in the first place, and why that book got written in the first place, because we've all been fascinated by dinosaurs, even though Jurassic Park wasn't out.
So yeah, I learned from this podcast that pre-Jurassic Park, kids still had a dinosaur phase.
Yep.
So the Phanatons are mortal enemies with, and I think they represent, I don't think the book actually tells you if they're good or evil. I'll go check really quick.
Well, their alignment is lawful, and the Arane are chaotic.
So the Phanneton represent the order side of the alignment, and the Aranea, their mortal enemies, represent chaos.
Right.
So the Aranea are a race of highly intelligent, magic-using arachnids who live in communities that are just webs spun between trees. They have, in their abdomen, they have like a brain. So it's like a normal spider abdomen, but it's like a second bump in it that has a brain. And the strangest thing about them is
they have hands.
They have hands, which is, yeah. So they have hands, which are required for spellcasting. I think that's why they included them having hands.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I mean, I'm not for certain, but yeah, I would imagine. So they can cast spells, and they can do human-like things.
So the Aranea, they each have their own layer that's like spun in web between trees, and the web. This is so funny to me. So the webbed over sections of their layers resemble caves. These are filled with many pieces of crude furniture made out of wood, vines, and webbed in place on the floor. They include storage chests and libraries used for spell research.
Yeah.
So they are intelligent, handed spiders that live in the trees, and they have libraries and furniture in their layers.
Right, in the middle of this crazy ass island, in the middle of the sea, they're getting books. But whatever.
Yeah, so this is the crazy shit that I love about D&D. Like, I love when D&D gets as weird as possible. I like when D&D says there are spellcasting spiders. Well, in order to cast spells, you have to make gestures with your hands. So they have hands.
Well, then they have to get those books. Yeah, they're spellcasters. They have to get them from a book.
Right. So, of course, they have libraries in their webs. So this is like one of the most bizarre monsters we've read about thus far. And I hope they return at some point.
Yeah, we need a whole thing about Eredni. Maybe they're associated with Loth, the demon queen of spiders. I don't know, but I want to read the book about them. I want to know what's going on.
But just the idea of it having its own layer with furniture that it has spun with its web is so I have to guess that many people that have played this adventure just have some weird ass encounters with the Aranea.
Or they just murdered them and attacked them, but still.
Yeah, or they were like, it is a spider.
I mean, I want to have a conversation with it. Like, I want someone to come up with an Aranea voice.
So next on page 11, I do want to talk about one of the most, this was mentioned in the foreword a few times, but it's one of the most infamous encounters in this, which is the deranged Ankylosaurus, who will rush out and attack the party in a frenzy of tail bashing. Although they are normally docile, the beast recently grazed on a patch of locoweed.
Oh my gosh.
It is now under the plant's influence. So I think that there is probably a time period where D&D could not get away with saying the word locoweed and having that in their adventure.
Look, it's not just weed, it's locoweed.
Yeah, this if you had read this when you were 10, this would have been when you learned about drugs.
Well, I lived in Humboldt County, so I knew about drugs beforehand. So I knew a lot about drugs, but
Mom, what's locoweed?
Yeah, I could see where some kid was like, "What's locoweed?" But yeah, like I lived in Humboldt, so locoweed was a normal thing.
And yeah, also like the 10-year-old that is reading through the Isle of Dread, I'm just gonna assume is a more adjusted and well-read and probably intelligent 10-year-old than most kids.
Yeah, definitely not well-adjusted though.
Okay, well-adjusted is probably not the word.
Well-adjusted.
Yeah, well-adjusted is not the right word. I guess I mean
they're at least reading through it. Yeah, they're at least, they're not worldly, but maybe they have at least a passing intelligence at this point.
Maybe they read the Elric books where that dude is like always doing weird drugs.
Right. I read those books.
Yeah, those are some interesting. That character is very interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting one.
So yeah, you will run into the deranged Ankylosaurus. Ankylosaurus? I've always said Ankylosaurus, but I was like a little kid when I read.
Yeah, I think it's Ankylosaurus. I'm not sure.
Okay. So apologies about mispronouncing things, but haven't thought of this dinosaur since I was a child. And on page 11, there's the Plesiosaur Menace, which is accompanied by... There's art that takes up about 2 inches to 4 inches square on the page. It has a very I am doodling this on my notebook during math class vibe.
Yeah, for sure. And it's kind of perfect in a lot of ways because it's small. It's like just did it. And I'm not sure who the artist was on that one because it doesn't really say.
Yeah, it's a very phallic looking plesiosaur eating an adventurer.
Yeah, and I also want to point out the one on page 10 with the RNA who's basically eating a fighter, which looks pretty cool too. But it's like a tiny little thing, and it looks like someone just sort of doodled it in.
Yeah.
They doodled it in and then put some ink on it and said like, okay, we're done.
Yeah, so there's a lot of eating in the art. If you go to this island, something will eat you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of like, these things are going to attack you and eat you, which is kind of what you want out of a mysterious island that's full of dinosaurs and monsters. And yeah, it's sort of like, oh, okay, yeah, this is a place where you're going to get eaten by a giant monster.
On page 12, we have the plateau, which is kind of the demarcation point between the center of the map and the outside of the map. And it's also like the demarcation point of the authors. So one person wrote this area, and Zeb Cook wrote this area, and Tom Moldvay wrote the outside area. So reading this, there is a thing I wanted to bring up that I thought was kind of hilarious. So the plateau rises 3,000 feet, and the only way to get on top of it is by climbing, by crossing the rope bridge, using a magical flying device, or climbing. And it says, characters without climbing skill cannot successfully scale the cliff, and even thieves must check for falling every 100 feet 30 times.
Yeah, it's kind of inaccessible unless you have some kind of flying.
So as a thief, you can definitely get up here if you successfully climb 30 times in a row.
Yeah, it's a thing.
Why include that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think they were trying to make it so like, oh yeah, this is the place you really want to get to because it's hard to get to. But it's definitely like, well, if you don't have a magic user who can cast fly, good luck.
Do you think it's because the way that so I'm noticing one thing when I'm reading these old modules is that the way that the thieves' skills, like move silently, hide in shadows, climb stuff, the way that those interface with the game is very weird and unlike anything else in the game.
Yes.
And I think that they are having trouble with the rules of that and keep having to bring it up and be like, well, you can't just basically saying like the thief can't just say, oh, I have an 80% chance to climb. Let me roll to see if I climb 3,000 feet. Oh, I rolled a 40. That means I got it. Yeah,
it's interesting. You see, I guess it's interesting to talk about in that even in AD&D, it's really one of the only things where you're kind of the characters are doing a percentile dice to see if something succeeds or not. Like it like thieves are sort of their own thing, and these skills are sort of their own thing, and they're the only ones that can sort of do it, which is also really strange. But it's this. I think it's sort of an interesting place where it's the first attempt to sort of have skills and skill checks.
Yeah, they don't know how to handle it yet.
Yeah, it's sort of like how do we have this thing? Like we need to be able to have our thief sneak around and look at stuff and do things, but we don't want all the other characters to be able to do it. We want that to be special to the thief, so that makes people attracted to playing the thief. And it's an interesting kind of dilemma that they're trying to fix that doesn't really need to be fixed. They want to make it challenging, too challenging almost to have skills. It's a strange interaction, and you can see that they're trying to figure out how to fit this together without everybody else being able to do it and making it special to thieves. So you want to play a thief, but at the same time, 30 checks, really?
Yeah, and now that I'm reading this, I can't tell from reading it if they're scared that like the thief is overpowered and they need to be brought in, or if this is a rules clarification that says like, hey, you can't just make one roll for 3,000 feet.
Right.
The intent is that you would make multiple rolls. And the way the thieves' abilities work too is very different than anything else in the game, because it's not like I roll to hit versus your armor class. You are involved because it matters what armor you are wearing. This is like I have 60% chance to pickpockets.
Yeah.
Baseline.
I mean, you obviously, like, some of the treasure things and stuff like that, you roll a percentage dice. But for the most part, in terms of, like, characters, it's the only thing where you're rolling percentages to figure out whether they succeed or not. And the percentage, like, you have a 62%. Like, where do they get 62 from? Why isn't it 65 or 60? And, it's sort of interesting to see, why is that?
There's nothing else that works like it. Like, spells don't work that way. Wizard doesn't work that way. Cleric doesn't work that way. It's just thief.
Yeah, you make a saving throw, it's a D20. You make, nothing is a percentage except for all these thieves things. And they, it's like they want you to play a thief, but then now they want you to also limit playing a thief because of this whole scalable wall, essentially. And it's interesting to see, like, well, how are you going to get up there other than, like, flying in some strange way?
Yeah, this is also levels 3 through 7. So this is kind of where you start. I feel like you start getting spells that solve these types of problems and not necessarily your combat issues. Like you have.
Yeah, at 5th level, you get the fly spell. You have access to it.
So moving on page 12, there's the Treant Forest.
Well, let's talk about the gold vein for 1 second. And the reason why I want to talk about the gold vein is, so at the top of this giant 3,000-foot cliff is a gold vein, and they put a lot of effort into you, like, mining the gold vein, and then bringing people up to mine the gold vein, and then bring it back down, but there's this giant 3,000-foot cliff that you have to navigate with workers and stuff, which is just okay, like, I guess there's a way to do that. But, are you going to, there's a piece here where you could be creative and your players could get creative about how they're going to ferry back and forth, workers or themselves to bring all this gold down. But I was always just like, what? When I read that, I was like, but what about the cliff?
Yeah. So it is funny because it's like, there's a gold vein. So obviously you're going to start paying people to come mine this for you.
Yeah, he alludes to it. He says he talks about it. It's like,
that's like gold equals experience in this. So that's like free experience, right? That counts as getting gold, doesn't it?
Yep.
So I guess like players finding a vein of gold and then mining it is maybe expected if it gets you a bunch of cool stuff.
Yeah, and also, like, if you make them slave labor, they might rebel. Like, what? We're enslaving people now? This module is sort of, obviously we would not talk about that these days, but, in 1980, they're like, yeah, no, we'll just enslave the native people and make them mine all the gift. And if they fall off the cliff, then who cares?
Yeah, and there is already rules about, like, retainers and getting them to do stuff and, like, making rules for that. It's kind of funny because that already kind of exists in the game. Like, there's ways to negotiate that type of thing in the game already.
Right.
I don't have anything in my notes about the gold vein. I guess I forgot. I do remember reading that, though.
Yeah. No, it struck me because of the giant cliff of, like, wait, it's sort of like, they put this giant, this is where you want to go. There's a giant, gold vein. There's, like, all this, that's where you go for the real high level adventure piece. But, you got to get there. And getting there and then getting back down and how you're all going to negotiate that is very interesting to me, of how you're going to figure all that out.
So moving on, the next thing that we have is a pretty fun encounter, the Treant Forest.
Yeah, I have to say this is probably one of my favorite encounters in the game.
So this prompted me to look up something, because obviously I know that these are based off Ents from Lord of the Rings. But I was like, I used to just think that, like, Treants are from, like, Greek mythology or something. And I don't think they are. I think they're just D&D's version of Ents. They're tree Ents.
Right, because you can't, copyright.
So that prompted me to like, wait a second, I just made this assumption. I should look this up. So here's the thing. These tree Ents are serious. They're HD 8 creatures. They have 2 attacks, which do 2d6 when they hit you. They will mess you up. But they are reclusive and try to avoid contact with the party. The only way to encounter them is if you try to cut one of them down or use one of them for fire.
Yeah. If you mess with them in a way that they don't like, meaning fire and cutting them down, they will come after you. But if you just leave them alone, they will leave you alone.
It's just when I read modules like this, I just imagine the TPK that happened. And I know at some point someone was in this area and they were like, we need to cut down some trees to get firewood. And they went to cut down a tree and it attacked them and they attacked it back. And then 15 more HD 8 treant creatures just came and just crushed the party to death.
Yeah. I also like that they kind of do their best not, I love the whole, we're going to drive the party off by throwing away all their goods. And, they try not to mess with anybody first, but, eventually, if you keep messing with them, they're like, well, we'll just attack you. But they really are just we just want to be left alone and do our tree things.
Yeah, we just want to sit here and be trees.
Right.
Oh, yeah. So on page 22, we have the village of Mantru, which is another interesting native village.
Yeah, the village leader whose name is Umlaut.
Yeah, so there's you'll be introduced to Fano, who is known as the talking chief, and then there's Umlaut, which is the tribal cleric, and the quote unquote chief is a stone statue carving of an old man that is kept in the council lodge on the lake.
I kind of love this. I like the treants better, but this whole village is just silly.
Yeah, so the way that this village works, it describes it this way, is that the actual chief is a small stone carving of an old man, and the talking chief is the person that talks to that statue and hears it talk back. It's not a magic thing. I think this is supposed to be a delusion. And the chief, the statue, tells them how to run the village, and that's how they run their village.
And I have to say, I didn't do this research. Now I'm just thinking of it now, but it popped into my head that someone was probably a Mormon, and they're like the talking stones in the Mormon religion, where they talk about, Joseph Smith went and talked and put his head into the magic stones. That's all I can think of with this, is that someone thought of that as that's the thing that they're doing.
If you worked for TSR in the 80s and you are a Mormon, please email our show.
Yeah, exactly.
This made me... so reading it, it's just it's obviously you go to this village and there's just weird stuff happening, but it seems like it works for these people. They're feasting on fish, paste, turtle soup, roasted birds, and they have beer. So whatever's happening in this village, it's working for them.
Yeah, it seems like the villagers are actually doing pretty well for whatever reason.
And there's a pretty cool hook here where it says the natives will freely give anything a character asks for, but will expect the same in the future.
Yeah.
And it says the DM should use this tribal custom at least once during the adventure. So it kind of gives you a little hook there of you can kind of tit for tat with these natives.
That ring of regeneration, I did feed you last night.
But yeah, it seems like they're friendly and they will talk to you and they will have a feast with you. It's just that their village leaders are a little out there as far as how they lead their village.
Yes.
Okay, so we get to, I think, Taboo Island is next. Is that on page 23?
Yeah, that's Taboo Island. This is where we're actually into a dungeon again.
Yeah, so we're into a dungeon again on page 23, Taboo Island, and it kind of gives you, in one sentence, the background. In a way, it introduces something we're going to talk about later. The island was once the center of the kingdom of Kopru until a native rebellion destroyed their power. It says, don't tell the players this, who the Kopru were. It's part of the taboo. No one talks about it. Oh, okay. So I think there's a typo in my book. Okay. So Typo Watch 2024. The players should not be told who or what the Kopru were. This is part of the taboo. For more details, see page 20. Let's go to page 20.
Page 20?
Page 20 is a map of the Fanatin platforms. So we didn't update that page number. Oops. We made this in 2 months. So maybe they moved the map. But yeah, typo in the book, and it looks like it's in your version too.
It is in my version as well.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. It talks about the Kopru later, but I'm not sure what page that's actually supposed to refer to.
It should be 26 is when they start talking about the Kopru.
But it basically says like this Taboo Island is where like the final stage of the adventure is. So this is the last part you're supposed to go to. But you could, I guess, theoretically wander here first.
Yeah, you could.
So this is like a mini dungeon. The temple entrance. Here it is. So the temple entrance, when you're going in, the landing and pillars are made of red marble. Set on poles thrust into cracks in the floor of the landing are many shrunken heads, jawbones, feather totems, and other primitive tribal symbols. So,
1980.
Yeah, cannibal tribal trope, but also just like shrunken heads. We are obsessed with shrunken heads at this time in pop culture. We are putting them in our horror movies. We are, I think the head shrinkers were a little bit later in the 80s, but the head shrinkers were there's a WWF team called the tag team called the Head Shrinkers, and their thing is that they were like native island people that shrink your head, and one of the members is became Rikishi. So there's your WWF history for our podcast.
Since Beetlejuice is in the zeitgeist because the new movie just came out, there is a scene where Beetlejuice gets his head shrunk by some kind of witch doctor kind of guy. So yeah, it's in, I forget when Beetlejuice came out first, but yeah, the tribesmen shrinking heads is a whole thing.
Yeah, it's all over pop culture. We're kind of obsessed with it. I am going to guess, what is the over under on there being a book about the history of shrunken heads in media? Let's see. Oh, it doesn't look like it. I'm seeing, so I just looked up shrunken heads. I'm not seeing it. So, if you are listening to this and you are a historian, I would like to read a book about the history of shrunken heads in Western media.
Yeah, right? Like, when did that all start?
Why is that everywhere in the 80s? Why are we obsessed with it? But yes, shrunken heads, primitive tribal stuff that we kind of stay away from now, that trope. And yeah, honestly, not even that trope, but like using the word primitive in this way, like they don't do that anymore.
Yeah, it's insulting to people, and just there's better words to use, better things to think about. I do remember when I went to college and I took an anthropology class, and we started talking about these things and going like, oh yeah, I guess my understanding of native cultures is very skewed. And, as we started talking about these cultures and how they come together, you learn something very different. Like, oh yeah, this is not, one is not better than the other per se. Just, people have a different worldview. And
it's also, it's kind of weird to say like primitive when it's like, okay, well, but they also figured out how to sail the ocean by looking at the stars and like invented all this other stuff that we don't give them credit for.
Right.
That we don't give natives credit for, that they were, already kind of dealing with before other cultures figured out how to deal with it.
If anybody ever wants to, there's a really good, Pulitzer Prize winning book called Guns. Let me look that up, actually.
Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Yeah, Guns, Germs, and Steel. That talks about why is it that Western culture was so prevalent and gained all these things, and it had very much to do with, spoiler alert, had to do with latitude.
Yeah, and the other thing about that too is that like I think that there is a and I'm definitely not an expert on this, but I feel like that there is one of the cultures that was like really obsessed with recording history was the Romans and the Greeks.
Right.
And one of the touchstones of their culture is that they thought everyone that wasn't them were these literally barbarians. Like that's where the word barbarian comes from.
Right.
So I wonder like how much of that is like, told by people's obsession with Rome.
Yeah, I mean the winners creates history, so it's if you really really want to go in depth on it, there's a lot to talk about, and it's fascinating to me.
It is fascinating. I'm not super qualified to talk about it, but I have noticed that we were obsessed in the 80s with shrunken heads.
Yeah, and spoiler alert, on the island are a bunch of natives who want to kill you.
So now we are playing basic D&D, we're playing expert D&D, but we're playing first edition D&D. So we do have to talk about rolling poorly and losing your character. So the private altar, room number 8. On the pedestal is a small, intricately carved stone box with 2 hinged doors. Inside is an unusual statuette of gold and coral. It looks like an amphibious humanoid with a smooth head, large eyes, and a tentacled, sphinctered mouth. The torso is human-like, with 2 arms that end in webbed, clawed hands. From the waist down, the body divides into 3 long tentacles ending in fluke-like fins, each tipped with a single claw. This is a kopru. See the description at the end of the module. Those who look at this statue must make a saving throw versus spells. Failure means the character becomes a secret servant of the kopru until the power of the statuette is destroyed.
Yeah.
So you go through this module, open a door, look at a statue. Hey, can you roll for me? You rolled a 3? Okay. You're a secret servant of the kopru now.
Yeah, let me just write down this thing and hand it to you. Or can we go into the next room for a second? Can I talk to you?
I know that we were like still developing dungeons and figuring out this point, but like I cannot stand you look at a thing and it does something horrible to you. Like I do not like interaction with the environment around you being inherently punishing, because what that turns into is players telling me that they walk into a room and don't look at anything and don't touch anything and don't hear anything and don't say anything.
Yeah, and the fact that you look at it, well, everyone's going to look at it. You're crazy. Like, why have you set it up that way? It should be they touch it. Like, if they touch it, they become that. But looking at it seems just grossly like, it seems like you really want this to happen to at least one person, if not maybe even the entire party, which could be, okay, well, we're done with our game.
Yeah, and it's hard to, in a tabletop RPG, it is hard to be it's hard to be synced up with your dungeon master about in your head where you are looking. That is not possible. Right.
That's why I think the looking part is just so kind of ridiculous. Not just kind of, I think it is ridiculous. But it's 1980 and we just started with this, and obviously the author really wants this to happen to somebody because it will make the game interesting. And they're right, it will make the game interesting.
I'm sure there are some great stories that people treasure about their characters looking at the statue and becoming a servant of a dark god, essentially.
Right.
It does make it's the Isle of Dread. Okay, it's not the Isle of hugs and kisses, right?
Right.
It's just, yeah. I know from being a DM, the thing I've noticed about visual stuff like this is it only works if it's binary. And what I mean by that is saying, like, you are fighting the Medusa. On your turn, you need to tell me if you're closing your eyes. And if you are, you have disadvantage. And there's no, like, oh, I'm kind of looking at it, but I'm looking away. Just because it's so hard to talk about where your character's looking.
Right.
And then it feels like it's a trap of being like, I want to see, is there any writing on the statue? Oh, that means you looked at it. Roll.
Yeah, it's even how you broach it, right? Like, well, is anyone looking at it? Oh, well, everyone's like, no, none of us look at it. Like what?
Yeah, so I know, like, I'm not interested in that conversation as a DM. I think maybe some other people might be, but I just, I like.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
it's weird. Like when I read this, I like the concept of someone becoming a Kopru servant and running off, and that's what they do. But it just doesn't seem that good. You can lose your character by looking at a statue. Not great, but part of like the charm, I guess, of these old modules.
Right.
So I fully expect, everything, or sorry, I fully accept, everything that I read here as historically important, even if I don't like it.
Yeah, it's something to take note of for sure. And it's the beginning of those pieces of like, okay, well, maybe this wasn't a good idea. So like you said, they just, in the 5th edition version, they just eliminated it because really there's no reason for it.
All right. So, there is another portion that I do want to talk about that is in area 2A. There is a 10 hit die giant oyster.
Oh my gosh, the giant oyster. So part of this module, you suddenly go into the second level. You might have been thrown in there, or, intentionally. And I think the second level in and of itself is sort of interesting in that it's all water filled, but not all the way. So you're sort of like neck deep or maybe shoulder deep in water for this whole level. And
there's some cool detail too, because it talks about how in one of the rooms if you're a human or an elf, you're like waist deep, but if you're a dwarf or a halfling, you have to actually be like held up above the water somehow, which is a cool detail. I like that.
So you're either getting a raft or, yeah, I do like that piece.
So this entire portion is underwater, and there's a giant oyster.
There's a giant oyster.
If it's attacked from the distance, it will close its shell and not open for at least a turn. There is a large black pearl inside of it that's worth 3,000 gold.
Which must be the giant pearl that the pirate was talking about, I guess.
Yeah, I didn't see that mentioned anywhere else in this adventure, so that has to be it. So the pearl may be picked from the open oyster. Non-thieves have a 5% worse chance than a level 1 thief. But failure means that the oyster closes, possibly trapping the unsuccessful character. You have to roll a melee attack. The oyster will not open by itself while under attack. It can be pried open by several characters with a combined strength of 50. And a knock spell will open it, which is a cool detail, I guess.
And it has a -2 AC if it's closed.
Yeah, so you get to the end of this adventure, and then you drown in a giant oyster because you got too greedy.
Yeah. Lessons learned.
So yeah, if your character was drowned by a giant oyster in the Isle of Dread, please email us.
Yeah, for sure. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, so I know it's happened at least once. So that's why I love reading these types of things. So like, I know somewhere this has happened to a person. So the next notable thing is the actual cope. There is a Kopru that still exists here, which is the weird fish tentacle thing that I just described earlier. It has a special charm ability that it will use on the players. So I do want to read about its charm ability because it's pretty intense. Let's pull this up. Okay, so here is the. So I'm reading the Kopru in the back of the book.
So let's talk about that charm ability. So the special charm of the Kopru is different from the charm person spell, and that the person will act normally, including the use of spell and magic items, but will be totally committed to the interests of the Kopru. The Kopru will know the thoughts and memories of the charmed character. A character may only be controlled by one Kopru at a time, but there is no limit to the distance at which the character may be controlled. The charm can be broken by dispel magic or by the death of the controlling Kopru. In addition, the controlled character gets a new saving throw at the beginning of each game month. If successful, the character breaks free of the charm.
And you make a save versus death ray, and it can do it on anyone within 30 feet. And the area that you fight the Kopru, it basically just is like, it repeatedly charms you, and it can make you run into traps and stuff after it charms you.
Yeah, it's a pretty good. It'll be an intense fight because you'll sort of be fighting your own party at the same time.
And there is, should the entire party be enslaved, the Kopru will attempt to use them to restore the Kopru's ancient kingdom.
Isn't that great?
If this happens, the DM can either start thinking up ways to save the characters can serve the Kopru, meaning like literally like you do a new campaign where you're serving the Kopru, which is I kind of love that actually. That's a cool way to start a campaign, I think.
Yeah, wouldn't it, like you have a bunch of 5th level characters or 7th level characters or whatever, and then we're starting a new civilization.
Or retire the captured characters from the campaign to be reintroduced later as NPCs. It says, one thing that's kind of cool here is it says the DMs and players should talk it over and come up with their own solution. So it actually is like, you should get some agency from your players on what to do next if this happens, which is cool. I like that.
Yeah, that is nice.
Not something you see often in these in these books.
No, they don't talk. You're like, oh, you're just wiped out. Well, they don't even talk about that. You're just like, there's a monster and stuff happens. And if you're all wiped out, then, oh well.
And just looking through the Wandering Monsters, there's a ton of dinosaurs in here. I do also want to note that the Wandering Monster table has multiple dragons on it.
Yeah, it has dragons on there.
Yeah, so this is like really, really dangerous.
Yeah, it is serious. Like, you could get pretty much bunched. Like, one of the ones, there's a sea dragon that has 3 breath weapons, and he even like puts in how, you would want that one to attack and make sure that it can slaughter everybody. So yeah, you're gonna be in for a lot of hard fights in this one. It
does also illustrate like multiple ways to continue the adventure on page 26, which is or further adventures on the island. So this is kind of giving you like, hey, this is how, I guess, if your players just like you run out of things to do, or maybe your players get bored, it's like, you can have them map the island, you can have them destroy the zombie master, one of the things that talks about is bringing back a dinosaur alive.
That is my favorite. I want to do that so badly. That sounds amazing. But if you think about it, like, how does that, because they have rules in which you can attack creatures and only do subdue damage, I guess. So maybe you can do that and subdue one?
You can, what is it, like, dominate a dragon, so why can't you dominate a T-Rex? I guess they're not intelligent, but...
Yeah, I guess.
Well, part of the paragraph basically says, like, hey, your players could have fun figuring this out.
Right.
Do you run around the legs of the T-Rex with a rope like the TIE Fighter in the AT-AT, or...
So is that an attack roll?
Yeah, how do you do that? It kind of just is like, hey, have fun with this. Another thing is to just exterminate the pirates, like, hey, just get rid of these pirates.
Right.
So this thing I noticed about this adventure, this is like a pretty quick read. It's not linear in a certain way. You're not reading dungeons and you're like, well, I need to, figure out exactly how these like go together. It's just like, here's an island. Here's a bunch of crazy stuff happening on the island. Have fun with it. Your players are going to walk around, run into dinosaurs eating locoweed.
Yeah. It's a Savage Land, dinosaur romp with fantasy tropes.
All right. Join us for our next adventure, where we will be reading Dwellers of the Forbidden City, another classic module written by Zeb Cook. So we're doing a back-to-back of Zeb Cook.
Yeah, we did on Mulvey, now we're doing Zeb Cook, apparently, with Owl of the Dread in the middle to get us to each one.
Make sure to follow us on your podcast app of choice, and follow us on Blue Sky at agmpod.bsky.social. Did you play Isle of Dread? We want to hear about it. Contact us at agmpodcast@gmail.com and join us next time for Dwellers of the Forbidden City. In the intro of the Golden... God damn it. Sorry. I'm looking at my... There's like a person with a flashlight outside. I'm like...
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what that is either.
I'm assuming it's food delivery.
Probably.
Anyways.
It's really weird.
Art that is like maybe 4 inches by 2 inches in the area, not resolution. What the fuck is it called? It looks like an amphibious. All right, did I say next week? I hope I didn't. Do you remember if I said next week?
I don't.
My brain's mush. I'm just going to say it again.
Oh my gosh, the giant oyster. Oh my gosh, the giant oyster. Oh my gosh, the giant oyster.
Oh my gosh, the giant oyster. Oh my gosh, the giant oyster.
Oh my gosh, the giant oyster.